99.99% of the contractors will not know of this product. Today I'm going to show you the advantages of using a epoxy grout in conjunction with a cementitious grout to achieve the best results in a bathroom. Epoxy grout is something that's really sturdy and strong. You first start by cutting it up and mixing it in small batches. In this case, we're only using epoxy grout in the niche area, so we don't need a whole lot. The advantage of using epoxy grout is it's incredibly durable and strong. Unlike cementitious grout, which is a traditional kind that tends to yellow, crack, have mold, and fall out over time, epoxy grout, once it's cured after 24 hours, is virtually indestructible. You can't break it apart, and the only way to remove it is to use a grinder to slowly abrasive it out. This makes epoxy grout very desirable for tight and fragile surfaces, such as when two mitered edge of tile meet in a niche. Whenever there is an outside corner where two tiles meet, I always use epoxy grout to ensure the edge is long-lasting and can stand up to wear. The upside of an epoxy grout is its stain resistance. The downside is it costs a lot more in material and in labor. Unlike a traditional cementitious grout that can be applied and cleaned up in relatively a long term, once a epoxy grout is dried and cured and not cleaned up properly, it's virtually impossible to get off. This is why it takes a lot more effort to apply and clean up the grout, making it more expensive, and actually the most expensive grout there is. Here I'm only applying the epoxy grout in the niche area where it's absolutely necessary. You see, I applied the epoxy a little bit beyond just a niche to give it overall structural rigidity. The rest of the bathroom will be grouted with traditional cementitious grout to save on cost. The epoxy sets itself as I'm applying it. I give it around 20 minutes and then scrape off all the excess. Then I'm able to use the cleaning solution that's recommended by the manufacturer to start wiping the haze. This haze is very important to get off right before the epoxy hardens completely. So right after the epoxy takes somewhat of a shape and is not super runny, we start to clean it off. I use a grinding sponge soaked in the epoxy cleaning solution to thoroughly go over all the surfaces. I rinse the sponge frequently in the solution and change out the solution quickly and frequently. Sometimes the sponge gets too gunked up and then I get a new sponge. Excess grout is left onto the tile and saved to examine how hard the epoxy between tiles have set. Now that we know the epoxy in a big blob have set decently well, we know the smaller chunks in the wall have set even more. This allows us to start the grinding process. I use a polishing stone as well as sanding paper and in conjunction with the dust extraction device to suck out all the dust and start to clean up all the edges. I'm looking to have a nice round over so that the epoxy is not sharp and causes a potential injury later on during use. For the rest of the bathroom, we're using the cementitious grout, Mapei Curacolor S, that's sanded. The sanded grout matches the sanded texture of the tile really well. Sometimes if we're using a high glaze tile on the wall, we will choose to go with a unsanded grout. In this case, it's better to go with whatever texture that the tile is closest matched to. Using a hard rubber grout float, I apply an excess amount of grout into all the crevices. During this process, it's important to push a lot more grout than you need in between the tiles, as sometimes we do have a little bit of empty space below the tile. Having excess grout forced in between the tile will help it fill all the void underneath the tile and make the tile really strong. This is less of a problem on the wall that you see here, but it's a good idea to get into the good habit of applying full grout into the tile so that whenever you are doing a wall or a floor, you know that the joint and your work is as strong as it could ever be. Because we do have a lot of grout surfaces to work with, and the grout, once you mix with water, starts to set up, I do have to move quickly here. I'm not as concerned with the excess grout onto the surface of the tile. As I mentioned before, cementitious grout haze can be cleaned up well after it's been applied. usually up to 12 hours. You are supposed to wait between 30 to 60 minutes from when you apply the grout to when you start to wipe it off. In my situation, because the bathroom is so big, when I'm finished applying the grout to all of the surfaces, the beginning part of the tile is already ready to have the grout removed. To do this, I use a grouting sponge. This is a very porous sponge that takes a lot of water and a lot of grout. I carefully wipe away all the excess grout on top of the tile surface while paying attention to not remove too much grout from the joint. You want the grout joint to be as full as possible to create an even and seamless look. If you apply too much pressure in this process, you can easily remove way too much grout and cause a valley to show up in the grout lines. 20 hours later, when the grout is fully set, I move on to the caulking stage. I'm using a 100% sanded silicone product that's the same color as the grout. This way, we have the same colored grout, silicone, and epoxy, and a very similar grout to the tile, creating a seamless experience throughout the entire bathroom. I apply a generous speed wherever two surfaces meet. This is important so that the grout that is hard do not get dislodged and crack when the two different surfaces contract and expand in different directions. If you see any cracked edges between the walls in your bathroom, it's typically because the contractor used grout instead of silicone in its place. We use silicone because it's water resistant and the sanded texture matches the grout to give a very even and seamless look, while the softness of the silicone keeps it flexible and ready to take on any of the dimensional changes between different wall surfaces. The silicone is applied in a generous speed while the caulking gun forces it into the crack. I then use a spray bottle with soapy water and a squeegee to wipe off the excess. Finally, I'm using clear silicone to seal up all the gaps with the plumbing protrusion and the tile. Now I have 2 layers of silicone in between the waterproofing and the plumbing fixtures, and then the tile and the plumbing fixtures. This way I ensure all the surfaces are watertight and will never leak during regular use.